I need to check the list of used names before writing. The forbidden names are Hannah Whitlow, Wade, Marcus, Diane, Coralie Wren, Theo Brennan, Roland Castor, Bryce, Clara, Patrice, Leonard, Dale, Claire, Carrot, Delphine, Simone, Nora, Sylvie, Becca, Agent Reyes, Marin Cole, Vera, Petra, Constance, Joelle, Audrey, Laura, Petra, Constance, Joelle, Audrey, Laura, Cassie, Lena, Owen, Dennis, Patricia, Eleanor, Randall, Beverly, Francis. I'll use fresh names: Tessa, narrator, mum, stepfather. Equals Kurt, neighbor Mrs. Okafor, lawyer friend Dominic, IRS agent Calloway, Dr. Pam. I still remember the exact color of the linoleum floor in that hospital room: pale green, scuffed near the door, with a thin crack running toward the window like a fault line. I remember it because I stared at it for a long time after I hit it. Because when you fall that hard and that fast, the floor is the first thing that makes sense again. My name is Tessa. I'm 32 years old. And the man who put me on that floor was the man my mother called her husband. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because that moment, the crack of his palm against my face, the cold shock of linoleum against my cheek, the sound my mother made from the bed above me, that wasn't where any of this started. It started 3 years earlier at a church potluck in Knoxville, Tennessee, where a man named Kurt Albright smiled at my widowed mother like she was the only person in the room. My mother, Jo, had been on her own for 6 years by then. My dad passed from a heart attack when I was 23, and she'd handled it the way she handled everything. Quietly, stubbornly, with a casserole dish in each hand and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She kept the house on Mercer Lane. She kept her job at the school district. She kept going. But she was lonely, I knew it. She never said it, but I knew. Kurt knew it too. He was 61 to her 58. Retired, he said. Something vague about investments and consulting. He drove a clean black F-150, wore collared shirts that looked freshly pressed, and had the kind of easy laugh that fills a room without being obnoxious. He brought my mother flowers on the third date. Real ones, not grocery store. He remembered that she mentioned liking hydrangeas. I was cautious. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't naive. I asked questions. He answered them smoothly, warmly, with just enough self-deprecating humor to seem humble. He'd been married once before, briefly, in his 40s. Grew apart, he said, shrugging like it still stung a little. That hurt made him seem real. They dated for 8 months. He proposed on her birthday in the backyard of the Mercer Lane house, with her sister and 2 of her friends watching. My mother cried. I stood there holding a glass of champagne and told myself I was happy for her. I moved back into my old bedroom 2 months before the wedding. Not because I was asked to, but because my lease ended and the timing felt right, and honestly, I wanted to keep an eye on things. I was working remotely at the time, doing contract graphic design, so geography was flexible. My mother didn't say she wanted me there, but the way her shoulders dropped when I brought my boxes in told me enough. The wedding was small. 40 people, a rented hall out near the fairgrounds, a DJ who played Can't Help Falling in Love during their first dance. I was the maid of honor. I gave a toast. I meant parts of it. The changes started small. They always do. First, it was the finances. Kurt sat my mother down one evening. I was in the next room, pretending to work, and explained that it made more sense to consolidate accounts. Easier to manage the household, he said. I can take care of the bills. You shouldn't have to worry about all that. My mother, who had managed her own finances for 30 years, nodded slowly and said, I suppose that makes sense. I came into the kitchen for water and found her signing a form to add him to her primary checking account. I said carefully, Mom, you sure about that? Kurt looked at me with a smile that didn't move above his cheekbones. Just simplifying things, Tessa, he said, like I was a child who'd asked a question slightly too loud at dinner. Then it was the paperless billing. Every account switched to email, her email which he now helped manage. Then it was her going to his friend's financial advisor instead of her own. Then it was small comments, consistent and quiet. Her spending was a little high this month. Her car needed to be traded in for something more practical. Her sister called too often, and we need our privacy as a couple. Her sister, my Aunt Renee, noticed before I did that my mother had gone quiet. Not sad quiet, managed quiet, the kind of quiet a person gets when they've learned that having opinions has a cost. I noticed other things. The pantry was always stocked, but the house felt tighter somehow. My mother used to keep a little cash envelope in the junk drawer for what she called fun money, 20 here, 40 there, to spend on whatever without thinking about it. The envelope disappeared. When I asked her about it, she laughed it off. Kurt handles everything now, it's just easier. Easier. That word came up a lot. It was 14 months into the marriage when my mother got sick the first time. Fatigue, nausea, tingling in her hands. The doctor thought it was her iron. Then her thyroid. Then stress. She'd lose a week. Rally. Then lose another week. Kurt was attentive in those moments, solicitous, always there. Always the one who'd answer the door when the home health aide checked in. Always the one who'd bring her medication and her tea. I work from home. I was around a lot. I started to notice that my mother seemed worse after days Kurt had been home, and better on the days he had his investment meetings across town. I told myself I was catastrophizing. I made myself believe it for about 4 more months. What broke me was a Tuesday in February. I came downstairs at 6 in the morning to find my mother sitting at the kitchen table, barely able to hold her coffee cup. Her hands were shaking. Her face had a grayish tinge that had no business being there. I sat across from her and took her hands in mine and said, "Mom, something is wrong. This isn't just fatigue." She looked at me with eyes that were tired in a way that went past the body. "Kurt says I just need to eat better," she said. That was the moment. I didn't say anything. I helped her to the couch. I covered her with the blanket from the closet. And when Kurt came into the room 20 minutes later, coffee in hand, I told him I was taking her to the ER. He smiled, patient, unbothered. "She's fine, Tessa. She's been like this before. It always passes." "I'm taking her," I said, and I did not look away from him when I said it. There was a long pause. The kind of pause that has a message inside it. Then he set his coffee down and said, "Fine, I'll come too." I did not want him to come. But I had no legal standing to stop him. He was her husband. The ER ran blood work. My mother was admitted. The attending physician, Dr. Rizad, fam, a precise, serious woman who looked like she'd heard every excuse in the book and believed approximately none of them, ordered a broader panel when the standard one came back with elevated heavy metal markers. I didn't know what that meant. Not yet. Kurt and I sat in the waiting room together for 4 hours. He was pleasant. He offered to get me coffee from the vending machine. He asked about my design work. He was, in every surface way, a concerned husband. I sat next to him and felt like I was losing my mind. When they moved my mother to a room, we went up together. She was pale against the white pillows, an IV in her arm, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her look. I sat in the chair beside the bed and held her hand. Kurt stood at the foot, scrolling his phone. Dr. Bam came in around 4 o'clock. She said they wanted to run additional tests, that there were some markers of concern, that she'd know more in 24 hours. She made brief eye contact with me that I now understand was intentional. At the time, I just thought she was thorough. Kurt left at 6 to handle some things at home. The moment the door closed behind him, my mother grabbed my wrist. "The vitamins," she said. "What?" "He started giving me these vitamins 6 months ago. Said my levels were low, that the prescription stuff wasn't working as well as supplements. I never looked at them, Tessa. I took them because he handed them to me. I told her to stop taking them. I told her we'd figure it out. I told her everything was going to be okay in that automatic way you do when you're trying not to fall apart in front of someone who needs you to hold it together." I left the hospital at 8. I went back to the house. Kurt's truck was in the driveway. I went upstairs to my mother's bathroom, to the cabinet where she kept her supplements. There were 4 bottles with her name on printed labels, the kind you get from a custom supplement company online. I photographed everything. I looked up the company. The account was registered to an email address I didn't recognize. Not my mother's, not Kurt's known email. A third address. I took 1 bottle. I put the others back exactly as I'd found them. I went to my room and I searched that email address for 3 hours. I found it attached to an Etsy account, a forum account, and after a lot of searching, a property record site in South Carolina. The property was registered to a woman named Gwen Albright, not a relative I'd heard of, an ex-wife he'd said didn't exist. I sat on the floor of my childhood bedroom with my back against the bed and my laptop burning warm on my knees, and I understood, slowly, what I was looking at. The next morning, I went back to the hospital early. My mother was sleeping when I arrived. I stepped into the hallway and called my friend Dominic, who'd gone to law school and was now a public defender in Nashville. I told him everything. He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Tessa, you need to call a private attorney today, not tomorrow, today. And don't touch the financial accounts, don't confront him, and don't tell your mother more than she needs to know right now." I asked him why. Because if he's done this before, he knows exactly when to run. I made 3 calls that morning. One to an attorney, one to a lab that does independent testing. I'd found one online that accepted mailed samples for heavy metals and toxicology. One to my Aunt Renee, who cried for 10 minutes and then asked me what she could do. I told her to come to Knoxville and bring her husband. What I did not do was call the police that morning. My attorney, a woman named Miss Thorne, who had a voice like gravel and a handshake like a door closing, told me to wait. "Evidence first," she said. "A husband giving supplements is not a crime on paper. We need the lab results, we need financial documentation, and we need him not knowing we're building a case." I hated waiting. I want to be honest about that too. Every day I watched my mother in that hospital bed, getting slightly better simply because she wasn't at home. And I wanted to walk into whatever room Kurt was in and end the entire situation with my hands. But I didn't, because my mother needed the case built right. She needed him actually gone, not just arrested and bailed out. The lab results came back in 9 days. Elevated arsenic, not accidental cooking rice levels. Consistent, elevated, over time arsenic. Dr. Pham received a copy through the hospital's channel, and her face, when she pulled me into the hallway, was the face of a person who is very angry but has to be very controlled. "I've already made the necessary report," she said quietly. "The detectives will contact you." 2 detectives from the Knoxville PD called me the next day. I gave them everything: the supplement bottles I'd photographed, the email address, the property record in South Carolina, the financial account changes, the timeline of my mother's illness. They listened. They were careful not to tell me much in return. They said they would follow up. Kurt had no idea. He visited the hospital every afternoon, unfailingly warm, unfailingly pleasant. He brought my mother flowers, real ones, not grocery store, and sat with her for an hour. He asked the nurses questions about her care. He called her sweetheart. I sat in the corner of the room each time and watched him like I was watching something I had to memorize, because I was. It was on his 4th visit, a Thursday, that everything detonated. My mother was having a better day. She'd eaten real food, her color was coming back. She was sitting up and had even laughed at something on TV before Kurt arrived. When he walked in, he kissed her forehead and then turned to me with that flat-eyed smile and said, "Tessa, I think your mother and I need some time alone." I said I'd be right outside. He said, "Actually, I've been meaning to talk to you. You've been putting a lot of stress on your mother with all your worry. I think it would be better if you took a step back." I stood up. "I'm not going anywhere." His voice shifted, just slightly. "You don't get to make that call. She's my mother. She's my wife." He said it like a door locking. My mother said quietly, "Kurt, stop." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that I would spend months trying to describe and still couldn't do it justice. Something between frustration and recalculation. Then he looked back at me and said very evenly, "You need to leave this room." I said no. He crossed the room in 4 steps and grabbed my upper arm and said something that I cannot now remember word for word. But the meaning was, leave or he would make me leave. I pulled my arm back. He grabbed it harder. I said, "Get your hands off me." And then he hit me. Open palm. across the left side of my face, hard enough that I went backward into the chair and then off it and onto the floor. The linoleum, palely green, scuffed near the door. My mother screamed. I lay there for, I don't know, 3 seconds, 5, with the metallic bloom of something in my mouth and my ears ringing and the ceiling tiles very white above me. And then I sat up. My hands were shaking, but they weren't shaking from fear. They were shaking because everything in me wanted to get up very fast and very wrong, and I had to make a different choice. I said as clearly as I could manage, I want you to know that this room has a camera. It didn't. I don't know why I said it, but I watched his face change, and I was glad I said it. The nursing station was 8 feet down the hall. A nurse named, I never learned her last name, just Angie, on her badge, was already coming through the door before I'd finished getting to my feet. My mother was crying. Kurt was standing in the center of the room with his hands at his sides, looking like a man trying to decide which story to tell. 3 minutes later, there were 2 police officers in the doorway. Not the detectives, just patrol, responding to the nurse's call. Kurt spoke first, smooth and immediately, explaining that things had gotten emotional, that I'd provoked him, that it was a family dispute. One officer took him to the hallway. The other crouched down to where I was sitting on the edge of the bed. She looked at my face. She asked me what happened. I told her all of it, not just the slap, but the supplements, the lab results, the detectives, the email address, Gwen Albright in South Carolina. She wrote everything down with the focused expression of someone doing a job they take seriously. Kurt was not arrested that day. I know that's going to frustrate people who hear this story. It frustrated me at the time with a fury I don't have adequate words for. But the officer explained, and Miss Splunk Thorne explained it again later, that with the active investigation already underway, the detectives needed to be the ones to make the move. Arresting him on the assault charge alone risked alerting him and collapsing the larger case before charges could be filed correctly. So Kurt went home, and my mother looked at me from her hospital bed with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not grief, exactly, not shock. Something older and more ruined than either of those. She said, very quietly, I didn't know. I took her hand. I said, I know. She said, I need you to tell me everything, so I did. She didn't say much when I was finished. She looked at the window for a while. Then she looked back at me and said, when your father died, I was so afraid of being alone that I think I stopped noticing things. She paused. I need you to not let me do that again. I told her I wouldn't. Aunt Renee arrived the next morning and did not leave for 3 weeks. The detectives moved faster than I expected once the hospital assault was on record. The supplement analysis, the lab results, the email trail to Gwen Albright, they started pulling on threads I didn't even know existed. Gwen Albright, it turned out, had filed a civil suit against Kurt 6 years earlier in Charleston, South Carolina. He'd married her, been added to her accounts, then she'd fallen mysteriously ill. She'd recovered when he left. She hadn't been able to prove anything criminal at the time, but the civil case had gone nowhere because she ran out of resources to fight it. There was a third woman in Ohio. Different name, same pattern. The detectives found her through financial records. She agreed to cooperate. 2 weeks after my mother's hospitalization, Kurt Albright was arrested at the Mercer Lane house on a Tuesday morning. I was not there when it happened. Ms. Thorne called me and said, they have him. I sat in the hospital parking lot in my car and cried for 20 minutes before I went up to tell my mother. The charges were extensive. Felony assault, attempted poisoning, Tennessee Code, criminal attempt to commit aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraud. And separately, the IRS had been watching. He'd been skimming income from the accounts he'd controlled across multiple women and reporting none of it. Tax evasion charges came from a federal direction, entirely separately from the state case. He pleaded not guilty. The trial took 11 months to begin. I was there every day. My mother testified. Gwen Albright flew in from Charleston and testified. The woman from Ohio testified by video. The toxicologist who analyzed the supplement bottles testified for 4 hours. Dr. Pham testified about the arsenic levels and what chronic exposure of that amount does to a body over time. And she did it with the flat clinical precision of someone who wanted to make sure the jury understood exactly what had been done. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. Kurt received 12 years on the poisoning and assault charges combined, with the financial exploitation charge adding another 4. The IRS case ran concurrent. He will be in his mid-70s before he is eligible for parole. My mother sold the Mercer Lane house. She said she couldn't walk through the kitchen anymore without feeling something she didn't want to feel. She bought a smaller place in a neighborhood she'd always liked. Closer to Aunt Renee, with a backyard she's turned into a garden that looks, in the summer, like something out of a magazine. She got her own financial advisor back. She has her own accounts, her own passwords, her own everything. She checks her own mail. We have dinner every Sunday. She calls it her reset. She makes something from scratch. We sit at the table too long. We talk about things that have nothing to do with any of this. Last month, she made a peach cobbler and told me entirely unprompted that she felt like herself again for the first time in years. I didn't cry. I waited until I was in my car. What I want people to take from this, and I've thought a long time about whether there's anything useful to say, because sometimes things just happen and there's no tidy lesson, is that the changes were small, every single one, small enough to explain away. Small enough to seem like just the adjustments that happen when two lives merge. Small enough that I doubted myself for months. Trust the small things. Trust the moment when you notice the cash envelope is gone. Trust the shift in someone's eyes when you ask a question they don't like. Trust the version of your gut feeling that says this is not right before your brain starts generating reasons why it probably is. And if someone hits you in a hospital room and the first thing you think is, how do I say this correctly so they can't wriggle out of it? That is not weakness. That is not being meek or passive or allowing something. That is knowing in the worst moment what actually helps. That is what I did, and it worked. My mother is planting dahlias this spring. She sent me a picture this morning of the first ones coming up, orange and red at the edges, just barely open. She wrote under it, "They made it, so did we." People ask me sometimes how I stayed calm, how I didn't scream or swing back or fall apart completely on that hospital floor. And the honest answer is that I don't entirely know. Some part of me just made a calculation in the middle of the worst moment, and that calculation was, the way you respond right now determines what happens to your mother for the rest of her life. So I stayed on the floor for exactly as long as I needed to, and then I got up. I've thought a lot about Kurt since then, not in an obsessive way, not in a hateful way, more in the way you turn a strange object over in your hands trying to understand how it works. What I keep coming back to is this: he didn't fail because he got unlucky. He failed because of what he actually was. Every choice he made, the supplement bottles, the email alias, the locked accounts, the quiet erosion of my mother's confidence, every single one of those choices was a weight he loaded onto a scale. He just assumed the scale would never tip. He assumed my mother was too tired, too trusting, too in love to look carefully. He assumed I was too young, too peripheral, too easy to dismiss. He was wrong about all of it, and his wrongness accumulated the same way his crimes did, quietly, over time, until there was simply too much of it to survive. That's the thing about people who operate the way Kurt did. They depend on invisibility. They need you not to look too closely, not to ask twice, not to trust the small cold feeling in your stomach that says something here is not right. The moment someone starts looking, really looking, writing things down, photographing supplement bottles at midnight, calling a liar at 7 in the morning, the entire structure they've built starts to fail because it was only ever built to survive inattention. My mother trusted too quickly, and I want to be careful about how I say that, because she is not to blame for what was done to her. But I think she would tell you herself. And she has that she let the fear of being alone make her less careful than she would otherwise have been. That's not a character flaw, that's just human. The loneliness after losing my dad was real, and Kurt knew how to find it and use it. What I hope she carries forward, and what I try to carry too, is that the antidote to that fear isn't caution exactly, it's self-trust. It's knowing that your own read on a situation matters. It's keeping the cash envelope in the junk drawer because it's yours and you don't need to explain it to anyone. I think about Dominic telling me, don't confront him, build the case first. I think about Miss Thorne saying evidence before action. I think about the 9 days I waited for the lab results, while Kurt brought my mother flowers and sat in her hospital room and smiled at me across the bed. Those 9 days were the hardest thing I've ever done, but they were the right thing. Anger is real, and anger is sometimes correct, but anger alone doesn't put someone in a room for 16 years. Patience and documentation and a toxicologist testifying for 4 hours, that's what does it. My mother sent me a picture of her dahlias this morning, orange and red. She is okay. We are okay. And Kurt Albright is going to be a very old man before anyone has to worry about him again. That's not luck. That's consequence. And consequence, in my experience, is slow and quiet and absolutely relentless. Exactly like the truth.